The crowd closed in fast, boots pounding on wet cobblestones, voices rising into a single furious roar. Clara Whitmore stopped in the middle of the market square, a basket of turnips forgotten in her hand, as she watched a man stumble backward against the fountain wall with nowhere left to run. Blood ran from a cut above his eyebrow. His coat was torn at the shoulder, and his hands were raised, though nobody around him seemed to care whether he was guilty or not. A merchant named Silas Pratt stood at the front of the mob, pointing a shaking finger at the stranger's chest. "Thief!" Pratt shouted. "He took coin from my stall and ran. I saw him with my own eyes." The stranger said nothing. He did not plead. He did not explain. He only looked at the circle of faces around him, calculating something, as though searching for the one gap he could slip through before the first blow landed. Nobody in the square moved to help him. A baker stepped back into his doorway and pulled the shutters closed. Two farmers exchanged a glance and turned away, pretending sudden interest in their cartwheels. An old woman crossed herself and hurried her grandchildren down a side street. Fear had a way of making people small, and every soul in that square had learned at some point in their lives that standing between an angry crowd and its target only meant becoming a target too. Clara set her basket down on the low stone wall beside her. She did not know why she moved. Later, when she tried to explain it to herself, she would only say that something about the way the man held himself struck her as wrong for a thief. He was too still, too composed. A guilty man ran or begged or wept. This man simply waited, the way someone waits who has faced worse than a market crowd and knows how to survive it. "Wait," Clara called out, stepping through the gap between two burly men. "Wait, all of you. Just wait one moment." Pratt turned on her, his face red with the effort of his own outrage. "Stay out of this, girl. This is none of your business." "I saw the whole square from the bread stall," Clara said, raising her voice so it carried over the murmurs. "I did not see him take anything from your table. I saw him standing near the well, and then I saw you grab his arm before he had even moved toward your stall." That was a lie, and everyone close enough to hear her knew it, including Clara herself. She had seen nothing of the sort. She had been 3 streets away buying thread when the shouting started. But the lie came out of her mouth with such steady conviction that even Pratt hesitated, his finger dropping an inch. "You did not see anything," Pratt said, though there was less certainty in his voice now. "I saw enough to know a mob deciding a man's guilt in the middle of the street is no different from thieves themselves," Clara said. "If he took your coin, then take him to the constable and let the law decide. But I will not stand here and watch good people become something ugly over a purse that might have simply fallen from your own belt." A ripple of unease moved through the crowd. Nobody wanted to be called ugly, and nobody wanted to be the one who struck first once someone had spoken plainly about what they were becoming. The men who had been closest to the stranger, fists half raised, lowered their hands and looked at each other, as if waking from something. The stranger used the moment. He caught Clara's eye for the briefest second, and in that look she saw not gratitude exactly, but recognition, as though he understood precisely what she had done and why it had worked. Pratt was not finished. He grabbed for the stranger's sleeve again, but Clara stepped directly between them, her chin lifted, refusing to move. "If you touch him again without proof," she said, "I will walk to the magistrate's house myself and tell him that Silas Pratt tried to beat a man to death in the market square with half the town watching and doing nothing to stop it. I doubt that will do well for your reputation, or your business." The threat landed. Pratt's business depended entirely on the goodwill of the town, and everyone knew the magistrate took a dim view of public brawls, especially ones that ended badly. He released his grip, muttering something about wasted breath, and stepped back into the muttering crowd, which slowly began to disperse now that the spectacle had lost its momentum. Within a few minutes the square had emptied into its normal rhythm, carts creaking past, vendors calling out prices, as though nothing at all had happened. Only Clara and the stranger remained standing near the fountain, the water trickling quietly behind them. "You did not have to do that," the man said. His voice was low, careful, with an accent that did not quite belong to the town, something more refined beneath the strain of exhaustion. "Nobody else was going to," Clara said simply. She studied the gash above his eyebrow, the way he favored his left side as though a rib might be cracked. "You need that wound cleaned before it turns bad. Do you have somewhere to go?" He hesitated, and in that hesitation Clara read the whole truth of his situation. He had nowhere. Whatever had brought him into this town, bruised and hunted and friendless, had also stripped him of any safe place to rest. "There is a shed behind my family's cottage," Clara said, before she could think better of it. "It is not much, but it is dry, and no one will look for you there. My mother will not turn away an injured man. Whatever foolishness brought him here. I cannot ask that of you, the man said. You are not asking, Clara said. I am offering. There is a difference. Something shifted in his expression then, some wall lowering by a fraction, though he quickly steadied himself again, as though unused to letting anyone see that far past his guard. My name is Aldrich, he said finally. Clara Whitmore, she answered, and found herself almost smiling despite the strangeness of the whole afternoon. Come on then, before Pratt decides to complain to someone with real authority. They walked together through the back lanes of the town, avoiding the main road where curious eyes might still be watching. Aldrich moved carefully, testing each step, and twice Clara had to slow her pace so he would not fall behind. He said little, but she noticed the way his eyes catalogued everything around them, the layout of the streets, the positions of doors and alleys, like a man accustomed to knowing every exit in a room before he sat down in it. Her family's cottage sat at the edge of town, a modest structure with a sagging roof, and a garden that had once been tended with pride before her father died and left the work to Clara and her mother alone. The shed behind it had housed chickens years ago, but the chickens were long gone, sold off during a hard winter, leaving only a dry, quiet space with a dirt floor and a single small window. Clara's mother, Ellen, came to the door as they approached, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. Her eyebrows rose at the sight of the injured stranger, but she did not ask questions, not yet. She had raised a daughter with a soft heart and a stubborn will, and she had long since learned that arguing with either quality rarely ended in her favor. He needs water and clean cloth, Clara said, and maybe something for the pain, if we have any of the willow bark left. Ellen studied Aldrich for a long moment, taking in his torn coat, the quality of the boots beneath it. Boots far too fine for a man claiming to have nothing. Whatever she thought, she kept it to herself. Bring him in the back, she said finally. I will not have half the street seeing him through the front window. Inside the small kitchen, Clara cleaned the wound above his eyebrow while her mother pressed careful fingers along his ribs, confirming what Clara had already suspected. Bruised, not broken, Ellen pronounced, though you will feel it with every breath for a week or more. Thank you, Aldrich said, and this time the words carried real weight, the gratitude of a man unused to receiving care freely given. You can thank us by not causing trouble in this house, Ellen said, though there was no real edge to it. Clara has enough worries without adding a stranger's secrets to the pile. Clara glanced at her mother sharply, but Ellen only returned to her bread dough, kneading it with more force than necessary, a clear sign that the conversation about their own troubles was not one she wished to continue in front of a guest. Later that evening, after Aldrich had been settled into the shed with a blanket and a plate of bread and cheese, Clara found herself standing at the small window of her own room, looking out at the faint light leaking through the shed's cracked boards. She thought about the way he had watched the crowd, calculating and calm even while bleeding. She thought about the fine boots beneath the torn coat, and the accent that did not belong to any family she knew in this town. Whatever Aldrich was, whoever he truly was beneath the mud and the blood, Clara understood one thing clearly. She had stepped into the middle of a mystery today, and there would be no simple way to step back out of it now that she had chosen to stand where everyone else had walked away. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shed's loose boards, and somewhere in the darkness a dog began to bark at nothing at all. Clara pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and did not sleep for a long while, her mind turning over every strange detail of the day, unable to shake the feeling that her life had just taken a turn from which there would be no simple way home. Near midnight she rose again and crept down the narrow stairs, careful to avoid the step that always groaned beneath a foot. Through the kitchen window she could see the faint outline of the shed, dark against the paler dark of the yard. She told herself she only wanted to be certain the man had not slipped away, that he had not left trouble behind him for her family to bear alone. But when she reached the back door and pressed her palm flat against the cold wood, she understood it was not caution that had drawn her from her bed. It was curiosity, sharp and insistent, the kind she had not felt in a long time. She did not open the door. She stood there instead, listening to the wind move through the bare branches of the old elm at the edge of the garden, and thought of the way Pratt's mob had surged forward with such certainty, so ready to condemn a man on nothing more than a raised voice and a pointed finger. It frightened her, how quickly people turned into something else entirely when fear and anger found the right spark. It frightened her more that she had been the only one willing to step into that fire. Her mother's voice startled her from the shadows of the kitchen. You will catch a chill standing there. Clara turned to find Ellen wrapped in her own shawl, unable to sleep either, it seemed. I keep thinking about what Pratt said, Clara admitted, about the coin. What if he really did take it? Then he will answer for it eventually, Ellen said, settling into a chair at the worn kitchen table. But I do not think that is truly what keeps you standing at this door in the dark. Clara said nothing, because her mother was right, and there was no use pretending otherwise between them. Whatever he is running from, Ellen continued quietly, it found him in our town, and now it has found its way to our door as well. I only hope you understand what you have taken on, Clara. Kindness is a fine thing, but it rarely comes without a cost. I know, Clara said, though in truth she did not know at all, not yet, not the shape or size of the cost that waited ahead of her. She only knew that when she closed her eyes she still saw the stranger's face in the moment before she stepped between him and the crowd, calm even as violence gathered around him, and something in that calm had asked a question she could not yet answer. She returned to her room at last, but sleep came slowly, broken by half-formed dreams of crowded squares and raised fists, and beneath it all, a single quiet certainty that nothing in her life would look the same again. A fist pounded on the cottage door before dawn, hard enough to rattle the frame, and Clara woke with her heart already racing before her eyes had fully opened. She threw a shawl over her nightdress and hurried down the stairs, certain that Pratt had returned with the constable, or worse, with more men willing to finish what the crowd had started. Instead, she found her mother standing at the door speaking to a thin, weathered man named Josiah Vane, the landlord who owned the small parcel of land their cottage sat upon. He held a rolled paper in one hand, tapping it impatiently against his palm. "Rent is due in a fortnight," Vane said, not bothering with any greeting. "I have come to remind you, since I understand there has been no payment set aside yet." "We will have it," Ellen said, her voice steady despite the tension in her shoulders. "We always find a way." Vane's eyes flicked past her, into the cottage, then out toward the shed at the edge of the garden, where a thin curl of smoke rose from a small fire Aldrich must have lit to keep warm through the night. His expression sharpened with interest. "You have a guest," Vane observed. "A relative, passing through," Ellen said quickly. "Nothing that concerns you." "Everything on my land concerns me," Vane said, though he did not press further, folding his paper back under his arm. "See that the rent is ready, or I will have no choice but to find tenants who value the arrangement more than you seem to." He left without another word, his boots crunching against the frost-covered path, and Clara watched him go with a tight knot forming in her stomach. Vane had raised the rent twice in the past year alone, always with some excuse about repairs or taxes that never seemed to materialize into any visible improvement. Half the town whispered that he answered to someone above him, some larger interest that used him only as a convenient face for decisions made elsewhere, but nobody had ever proven it, and nobody dared ask too loudly. Clara found Aldrich awake in the shed, sitting up carefully against the wall, one hand pressed to his ribs. The color had returned to his face overnight, though the bruise above his eyebrow had darkened into a deep, ugly purple. "I heard voices," he said. "Our landlord," Clara said, settling onto an overturned crate across from him. "He raises the rent whenever it suits him and threatens to remove us if we cannot pay. It has become something of a tradition in this house." Aldrich's jaw tightened, a flicker of something sharp crossing his features before he smoothed it away. That is not uncommon, unfortunately. Men in positions of small power often mistake pressure for authority. "You speak as though you have seen a great deal of it," Clara said, studying him carefully. "I have seen enough," he said, offering nothing further, and Clara did not push. She had learned already that pressing him only made the walls around him rise higher, and there was something in his guardedness that made her curious rather than frustrated, as though the answer, whenever it finally came, would be worth the patience required to wait for it. Over the following days, a quiet rhythm settled between them. Clara brought food to the shed each morning before her chores began, and in the evenings, once her mother had gone to bed, she would sit with Aldrich while he slowly regained his strength, talking about small things at first, the weather, the harvest, the state of the roads leading out of town. He asked careful questions about the town itself, about Vane, about the estate that owned most of the surrounding land, and Clara answered honestly, not realizing at first how much information she was giving away to a man whose true purpose remained a mystery to her. "You ask a great many questions for someone with nothing to gain from the answers," she observed one evening, as rain tapped softly against the shed roof. "I find your town interesting," Aldrich said simply, though his eyes held something more careful behind the casual words. Clara let it go, though she noticed, and filed it away alongside every other small strangeness that had accumulated around him. His hands, though roughened now from days of labor and travel, still carried the softness of someone who had not always worked with them. His speech, however plain he tried to make it, occasionally slipped into a formality that no farmer or tradesman in town would have used, and once, when she had asked him directly where he came from, he had answered with a place so vague it could have meant anywhere, or nowhere at all. Meanwhile, the pressure of the coming rent payment settled over the household like a physical weight. Clara took on extra mending work from 3 families in town, staying up late by candlelight to finish shirts and hems for coins that amounted to barely enough to make a dent in what they owed. Her younger brother, Tom, only 12 years old, began skipping his lessons at the village school to help gather firewood they could sell at the market, though Clara scolded him each time she found out, worried that trading his education for a handful of coins would only trap him further in the same difficult life she and her mother had known. "We will manage," Ellen kept insisting, though the lines around her eyes had deepened noticeably since Vane's visit, and Clara sometimes caught her staring at the small tin box where they kept what little savings remained, doing sums in her head that never seemed to add up to enough. On the 4th day, Tom came running into the yard with his cheeks flushed and his eyes bright with the particular excitement only a boy of 12 could carry after witnessing something he did not fully understand. "Clara," he announced, breathless, "there are riders on the North Road. Fine horses, better than anything Vane could ever afford. I counted 6 of them, and one man kept asking around the tavern about a traveler who might have come through with an injury." Clara's stomach tightened immediately. "What did they ask exactly?" she said, crouching to Tom's level. "Whether anyone had seen a man matching a certain description," Tom said, proud of his own memory for detail. "Tall, dark-haired, a cut above one eyebrow. Old Prattneer told them everything until the innkeeper's wife pulled him aside and reminded him that gossip has cost this town more than one good customer over the years." "Did they say why they wanted him?" Clara asked. Tom shook his head. "Only that it was a matter of importance, and that there would be a reward for good information." He hesitated, then added, in a smaller voice, "You don't think it has anything to do with the man in our shed, do you, Clara?" Clara made him promise, with the seriousness she usually reserved for matters of real danger, that he would say nothing to anyone about their guest, not to his friends, not to the boys he raced through the market lanes with, not even if someone offered him coin for the information. Tom, to his credit, understood the weight of her request, and nodded solemnly, his earlier excitement giving way to something more careful. That night, Clara relayed the encounter to her mother, who listened with her hands pressed flat against the kitchen table, her expression unreadable in the candlelight. "Whoever he is," Ellen said finally, "he has powerful people looking for him, and powerful people rarely go looking for someone without a reason that could easily become our problem as much as his. He has done nothing but show us kindness since he arrived," Clara said, more defensively than she intended. "Kindness is not innocence," Ellen said, though her tone had softened. "I am not asking you to turn him out, Clara. I am asking you to keep your eyes open. Whatever storm follows that man will not care whether we are standing in its path when it finally breaks." Clara carried her mother's warning with her through the following days, watching Aldrich more closely than before, cataloging every small detail that did not quite fit the story of an ordinary traveler down on his luck, the way he instinctively positioned himself where he could see the door of any room he entered, the careful, deliberate way he chose his words, as though each one had been weighed before it was allowed to leave his mouth, the single ring he kept hidden beneath his shirt, which she had glimpsed only once, gold and heavy, engraved with a crest she did not recognize but suspected meant a great deal more than he was willing to admit. One evening, Aldrich found Clara sitting alone at the kitchen table, a needle in her hand and a pile of mending stretched before her, her shoulders bowed with exhaustion. He had grown stronger over the past week, enough to move without wincing at every step, and he stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking. "You should rest," he said. "There is no time for rest," Clara answered, not looking up from her work. "The rent will not pay itself, and Tom needs new boots before winter fully sets in, and my mother pretends everything is fine when I can see she has not slept properly in days." Aldrich crossed the room and sat across from her, watching her hands move quickly and precisely despite her obvious weariness. "Why do you carry all of this yourself?" he asked. "Surely there is someone in town who could help." "Nobody helps for free," Clara said, a note of bitterness slipping into her voice before she could stop it. "Everyone in this town is one bad season away from their own ruin. Kindness is a luxury most people cannot afford, however much they might wish otherwise." "And yet you offered it to a stranger bleeding in the market square," Aldrich said quietly. Clara finally looked up at him, her needle stilling in her hand. "That was different," she said, though she could not immediately explain why, only that it had felt different, an instinct she had followed without calculating the cost the way she calculated every other decision in her life. Perhaps it was not so different, Aldrich said. Perhaps you simply have more courage than you give yourself credit for. Something warm passed between them in that moment, quiet and unspoken, and Clara felt her face flush before she looked back down at her mending, unwilling to examine too closely what that warmth might mean. She was a poor seamstress's daughter with rent she could not pay and a brother growing up too fast under the weight of their circumstances. Whatever Aldrich was, whatever secrets he still carried close to his chest, she could not afford to let herself hope for anything beyond the simple gratitude of a stranger she had helped and would likely, eventually, watch leave. The next afternoon Vane returned, this time accompanied by another man Clara did not recognize, older and heavier, dressed in a coat far finer than anything typically seen on the streets of their small town. The two men stood at the edge of the property, speaking in low voices and glancing occasionally toward the shed, and something about their posture, the way they seemed to be assessing rather than simply visiting, sent a cold feeling down Clara's spine. "Who is that with him?" she asked her mother, watching from the kitchen window. "I do not know," Ellen said, though her tone suggested she had her own uneasy suspicions. "But I do not like the way they are looking at our property." That evening, Clara relayed the encounter to Aldrich, describing the stranger in as much detail as she could remember, the cut of his coat, the way he had carried himself with an air of quiet command despite saying little. Aldrich's expression grew unusually still as she spoke, his eyes narrowing with an intensity she had not seen from him before. "Did you hear anything they said?" he asked. "Only a little," Clara admitted. "Something about an inspection, and a name I did not recognize. Colton, I believe." Aldrich was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as though weighing some private decision. Finally he spoke, his voice lower and more careful than before. "I need to ask you something, Clara, and I need you to trust that I have good reason for asking it, even if I cannot yet explain everything." "Ask," she said. "If men come looking for me, describing me by a different name than the one I gave you, I need you to say nothing. Not to protect me from the law," he added quickly, seeing the alarm rising in her expression, "but because there are people who would use knowledge of my presence here to hurt others, including possibly your own family. I promise you, when the time is right, I will explain everything." Clara studied him for a long moment, weighing the fear that tightened in her chest against the strange, steady trust that had grown between them over the past week. Whatever he was hiding, she did not believe it came from guilt or wrongdoing. There was something else in his eyes, something closer to a burden carried out of duty rather than shame. "I trust you," she said finally, though even as she spoke the words she understood she was stepping further into a mystery with no clear edges, no way of knowing how deep it would eventually pull her, or what it would cost her family before the truth finally came to light. Outside, the wind carried the distant sound of Vane and his companion still talking near the property line, their voices too low to make out clearly, but their presence lingering over the household like a shadow that refused to lift, a quiet warning of trouble that had not yet fully arrived, but was drawing closer with every passing day. Long after the house had gone dark, Clara lay awake listening to the settling creaks of the old cottage, turning over everything she had learned in her mind, the riders on the North Road, the hidden ring beneath Aldrich's shirt, the strange name Colton that seemed to mean something important to him though he had refused to explain it. She thought of her mother's warning about storms and the people who stood too close when they finally broke, and she thought too of the quiet warmth in Aldrich's voice when he had told her she carried more courage than she gave herself credit for. Whatever truth waited on the other side of his silence, she found she was no longer willing to simply wait for it to arrive on its own. She intended to be ready, whatever shape it finally took, for her family's sake as much as her own. The riders returned at dawn, this time stopping directly outside the Whitmore cottage, their horses' breath steaming in the cold morning air. Clara watched through the kitchen window as a tall man in a dark traveling coat dismounted and approached the door with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being obeyed on sight. Ellen answered before Clara could stop her, and the man removed his hat with a stiff, formal bow. "Forgive the early hour, madam," he said. "I am searching for a gentleman who may have passed through this town some days ago, injured and traveling without escort. It is a matter of great importance to his household." "We have seen no such person," Ellen said, her voice remarkably steady. The man's eyes moved past her, scanning the yard, the shed, the thin trail of smoke rising from its chimney pipe. "If you should happen to hear anything," he said, "there would be a generous reward for information leading to his safe return. His name is Aldrich, Lord Aldrich Ashcombe." Clara's breath caught in her throat at the sound of the title, though she kept her expression carefully blank, remembering her promise. The man bowed again and returned to his horse, and the riders continued down the road toward the center of town, where Clara had no doubt they would ask the same questions of every shopkeeper and tavern owner willing to talk. The moment the door closed, Ellen turned to Clara with wide, alarmed eyes. "Lord Ashcombe," she repeated. "Clara, do you understand what you have brought into this house?" "I did not know," Clara said, though even as she spoke she felt the pieces sliding into place, the fine boots beneath the torn coat, the formal manner of speech he could never quite hide, the ring bearing a crest she had not recognized because she had never before had reason to know what a duke's household looked like up close. She found Aldrich in the shed moments later, his expression grim, clearly having heard enough through the thin walls to know his pursuers had finally arrived close enough to be dangerous. "You are the Duke," Clara said, not quite a question. Aldrich's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might deny it, cling to the fiction that had protected him so far. Instead, he exhaled slowly and nodded. "Ashcombe," he confirmed. "I left my estate 3 weeks ago because I received word that something was deeply wrong within it, corruption among the men I trusted to manage my lands and my people, and I could not learn the truth of it wearing a title that made every man around me too careful with his answers. I traveled without escort, dressed plainly, hoping to see with my own eyes what was truly happening to the tenants under my protection. And the attack in the market," Clara said. "Not an accident," Aldrich admitted. "I had already begun asking questions in the wrong places, of the wrong men. Whoever set that mob upon me wanted me gone before I learned too much, though they were clever enough to make it look like nothing more than a common theft accusation." Clara sank onto the overturned crate, her mind spinning through the implications. "Colton," she said suddenly. The name Tom overheard. "Is he connected to this?" "Edgar Colton manages several of my estates," Aldrich said, his voice hardening. "He reports directly to me, or he is meant to. Instead, I have reason to believe he has been quietly draining tenant rents into his own accounts, falsifying records, and punishing anyone who dares to complain by raising their rates or threatening eviction. Josiah Vane, your own landlord, answers to him." The realization settled over Clara like a physical weight. Every hardship her family had endured, every unexplained rent increase, every excuse Vane had offered about repairs that never happened, all of it traced back to a man sitting comfortably within Aldrich's own household, hiding behind the Duke's authority while betraying everything that authority was meant to protect. "You have to expose him," Clara said. "I intend to," Aldrich said. "But Colton is careful, and he has powerful allies who benefit from his arrangement. Men who would rather see me discredited or removed than lose the income they have grown accustomed to skimming from people who can least afford it. I cannot simply march back into my own hall and make accusations without proof. He would have every excuse ready, every ledger rewritten before I could examine it properly." "Then what will you do?" Clara asked. Aldrich was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her chest tighten. "I need someone inside the town who understands the tenants' true situation, who can gather what they have suffered without raising suspicion. Someone Colton and Vane would never think to watch closely because she appears to be nothing more than a struggling seamstress's daughter." Clara understood immediately what he was asking, and the danger woven through it. "You want my help." "I would not ask if I believed there was another way," Aldrich said, "but I have watched you these past days, Clara. You understand this town in ways I never could, however long I lived here in disguise. People trust you. They speak freely around you. That trust could be the difference between exposing Colton with solid proof or losing this fight entirely, and leaving families like your own to suffer under his hand indefinitely." The weight of what he was asking settled over her slowly, and yet beneath the fear, Clara felt something else stirring, a fierce, quiet anger at everything her family had endured under Vane's excuses. Everything the whole town had quietly accepted because nobody believed there was any other choice. If there was a chance to end it, truly end it, she found she could not simply walk away from that chance out of fear for herself. "I will help you," she said, "but you must promise me something in return. Whatever happens, my family will not suffer for it. If this goes wrong, if Colton or Vane discover what we are doing before you are ready to move against them, you will protect my mother and my brother, whatever the cost to yourself." "You have my word," Aldrich said, and something in the steadiness of his voice told her he meant it absolutely, the kind of promise a man only made when he understood precisely what it might cost him to keep it. That first night, after Clara had agreed to help him, Aldrich drew a rough map of the estate lands on a scrap of paper, marking the properties where he suspected Colton's manipulations ran deepest. He explained the structure of his household with a patience Clara had not expected, walking her through the roles of stewards, bailiffs, and clerks. the layers of authority that made it easy for a man like Colton to hide corruption behind official-looking ledgers that few ever thought to question. "My father trusted him completely," Aldrich said, a note of old grief threading through his voice. "Colton served this family for 20 years before I inherited the title, and I made the mistake of assuming that loyalty to my father meant loyalty to the estate itself. I see now how naive that assumption was. Men do not stay loyal to ideals, they stay loyal to whatever arrangement benefits them most, until the moment it no longer does." "You could not have known," Clara said gently. "Perhaps not," Aldrich said, "but I should have looked closer, sooner. Too many people suffered while I trusted the wrong man's word over the evidence quietly gathering around me." Clara studied the rough map for a long moment before speaking again. "If Colton has grown this bold, taking coin from tenants and using men like Vane to enforce it, he must believe himself untouchable. Men who feel safe rarely bother covering every trace of what they have done. That is precisely the weakness I intend to use against him," Aldrich said, a hard edge entering his voice that Clara had not heard from him before. The voice, she suspected, of the Duke rather than the injured stranger she had first pulled from the market crowd. "But weakness alone is not proof, and proof is what a court, or my own council of advisors, will demand before they act against a man who has served this family for 2 decades. That is where your help becomes essential. Testimony from a dozen tenants, consistent and detailed, will be far harder to dismiss than my suspicions alone." Clara nodded slowly, already turning over in her mind which families she might approach first, which ones trusted her enough to speak honestly about hardships they usually kept carefully hidden out of pride or fear. She thought of Margaret Poole's leaking roof, of Edwin Hale's threatened plow horse, of a dozen other small injustices she had witnessed over the years without ever understanding they were part of something larger, something deliberate, orchestrated by a man safely distant from the suffering his greed had caused. "I know where to begin," she said. Over the following days, Clara moved carefully through the town, visiting families she had known her whole life under the guise of simple errands and neighborly conversation. She listened as an elderly widow named Margaret Poole described how her rent had tripled in 2 years despite the roof of her cottage leaking through every winter storm. She heard from a young farmer named Edwin Hale how Vane had threatened to seize his plow horse when he fell 3 days behind on a payment, even though the harvest that season had been the best in a decade. Coin that should have easily covered the debt, if it had not somehow vanished before reaching wherever it was truly meant to go. Each evening, Clara returned to the shed and relayed what she had learned, and Aldrich recorded it carefully in a small notebook he kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard, building a picture of exploitation far more extensive than even he had suspected. The pattern was consistent everywhere she looked. Rents raised without cause. Repairs promised and never completed. Threats of eviction used to silence anyone who complained too loudly, while the coin that should have maintained the estate's own properties and paid its workers fairly disappeared into accounts that led, Aldrich suspected, directly back to Colton and a small circle of men who profited alongside him. "You have gathered more in a week than my own investigators managed in a month," Aldrich told her one evening, genuine admiration in his voice as he reviewed the growing list of testimonies. "People do not trust investigators," Clara said. "They trust neighbors. There is a difference, just as you said about kindness once, though I imagine you did not expect it to become quite so useful to your cause." Aldrich allowed himself a rare, tired smile. "I did not expect a great many things when I woke up bleeding against a fountain in your market square," he admitted. "I certainly did not expect to find the one person willing to help me when it seemed everyone else in the world had decided it was safer to look away." Clara felt the warmth of his words settle somewhere deep in her chest, though she quickly reminded herself of the enormous distance that still separated a duke from a seamstress's daughter, regardless of the trust and quiet affection that had grown between them over these strange, dangerous weeks. Whatever this was becoming, it could not survive the return of his true life, his true position, the world of titles and estates that would never truly make room for someone like her. But there was little time to dwell on such thoughts, because on the 6th night, as Clara made her way home from Margaret Poole's cottage with a fresh page of testimony folded carefully in her pocket, she noticed a figure watching her from the shadows near the town well, still and silent, before melting away into the darkness the moment she turned to look directly at him. 2 days before the incident at the well, Vane had come by the cottage again, this time alone, his manner colder than before. He had stood in the doorway studying Clara with a new wariness, as though some rumor had already reached him that troubled his usual confidence. "I hear you have been asking a great many questions around town," Vane said, "visiting the Pooles, the Hales, talking about rents and repairs that are none of your concern." I was only being neighborly, Clara said, keeping her voice light despite the sudden hammering of her pulse. Neighborly, Vane repeated, as though tasting the word and finding it distasteful. Be careful, girl, that your neighborliness does not become something Mr. Colton finds inconvenient. He does not take kindly to inconvenience, and neither, I promise you, do I. He left without waiting for a response, and Clara had stood frozen in the doorway for a long moment afterward, replaying the exchange, trying to determine how much he truly suspected, and how much was simply the reflexive suspicion of a man accustomed to guarding secrets that were not entirely his own. She had not told Aldrich about that visit either, not immediately, telling herself she did not want to worry him over what might have been nothing more than Vane's usual unpleasantness. But standing now at the shed door with the memory of the watching figure by the well still fresh in her mind, she understood she could no longer afford to keep such details to herself, however much she wished to spare him, or herself, the fear that came with acknowledging how close the danger had already crept. She told him about Vane's visit as well, watching his expression shift from concern to something more focused, more determined, the look of a man recalculating a strategy in real time against a threat that had moved faster than he anticipated. We are running out of room to be careful, Aldrich said finally. I had hoped to gather enough testimony to move against Colton with overwhelming proof, evidence so complete that even his allies could not defend him. But if Vane is already suspicious, if Colton has men watching you at the well, we may not have the luxury of that much time. What do you suggest? Clara asked. I need to send word to my council, quietly, without revealing my location to anyone who might still be searching for me on Colton's behalf, Aldrich said. If I can bring even 2 trusted men from my own household here, men whose loyalty I have never had reason to doubt, we can begin building a case swiftly enough to act before Colton realizes how much ground he has already lost. And if he realizes first? Clara asked. Aldrich did not answer immediately, and his silence told her everything his words did not. That the danger she had stepped into extended now not only to strangers and testimonies and ledgers, but to her own safety, and the safety of everyone she loved beneath her family's roof. She said nothing to her mother that night, not wanting to frighten her further, but she told Aldrich everything the moment she reached the shed, watching his expression darken with a concern he could no longer fully hide. They are watching you now, he said quietly, which means we have less time than I hoped. Colton would not waste resources following a seamstress's daughter unless he already suspects what you have been doing, and once he is certain, he will not hesitate to act against you to protect himself. Then we finish this quickly, Clara said, though a cold thread of fear had settled beneath her determination, a recognition that whatever safety she had once taken for granted in her quiet, ordinary life had now been permanently stripped away by the choice she had made in that crowded market square, the choice to step forward when everyone else had walked away. Outside, the wind stirred through the bare branches of the old elm, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the garden wall, Clara could not shake the feeling that the same eyes that had watched her at the well were still out there now, patient and unseen, waiting for the right moment to strike at whatever weakness they believed they had finally found. She thought of Tom asleep upstairs, still too young to fully understand the danger gathering around their small household, and of her mother's tired eyes, worn thin already by years of struggle long before Aldrich had ever stumbled bleeding into their lives. Whatever came next, Clara understood there would be no retreating now to the quiet, uneventful existence she had known before that afternoon in the market square. She had chosen a side the moment she stepped between a stranger and an angry crowd, and every choice since had only carried her further from any path back to safety. Yet beneath the fear, something steadier had also taken root, a conviction that had not existed in her before these past weeks, the growing certainty that silence and looking away, however safer they might seem, had never truly protected anyone in this town from men like Colton and Vane. It had only made their cruelty easier to sustain. Whatever price this fight demanded of her, Clara found she would rather pay it standing forward than spend the rest of her life wondering what might have changed had she simply walked away like everyone else. 3 riders arrived at the edge of town before noon, their horses lathered from hard travel, and this time they did not stop to ask quiet questions in the tavern. They rode directly to the market square, where a crowd had already gathered to watch, drawn by the unmistakable quality of the men's dress and the crest embroidered on their coats, a crest Clara now recognized instantly from the ring Aldrich kept hidden beneath his shirt. A tall, silver-haired man dismounted first, scanning the crowd with sharp, assessing eyes before his gaze settled and held. He crossed the square with purposeful strides, and as he drew closer, Clara saw the moment recognition and relief broke across his weathered face. "Your Grace," the man said, bowing deeply before Aldrich, who had stepped forward from the edge of the crowd where he and Clara had been standing together. "We feared the worst when your last letter arrived unfinished." A murmur rippled through the gathered townspeople, confusion giving way rapidly to astonishment as whispers passed from one person to the next. "Your Grace." The words repeated themselves through the crowd like a stone dropped into still water, spreading outward in widening rings of disbelief. The stranger, the man everyone had watched Clara defend against Pratt's accusing mob, the same man who had labored quietly in a chicken shed for weeks, mending fences and hauling water like any common laborer, was the Duke of Ashcombe. Pratt himself stood near the front of the crowd, his face draining of color as the implications settled over him. He had accused a duke of theft in the middle of a public square, had very nearly incited a crowd to violence against him, and there was no undoing what had already happened in front of half the town. Aldrich addressed the gathered crowd directly, his voice carrying the natural authority of a man born to command attention, a stark contrast to the careful, guarded manner Clara had grown accustomed to over the past weeks. "I owe this town an explanation," he said, "and I intend to give one, though not today, and not without the full truth laid bare before all of you. I came here disguised, investigating serious wrongdoing within my own estate's management, wrongdoing that has directly harmed many families in this town, through unjust rents and false threats. I was attacked in this very square because someone wished me silenced before I could learn the full truth. I would have died in that crowd, or worse, been dragged away and disappeared entirely, had one person not stepped forward when every other soul here chose to look away." His eyes found Clara across the square, and every head turned to follow his gaze, the weight of sudden, overwhelming attention settling onto her shoulders like a physical thing. Clara Whitmore risked her own safety and her family's security to help a stranger she owed nothing, Aldrich continued. She has spent these past weeks helping me gather proof of the corruption harming this town, at considerable personal risk. Whatever comes next in restoring justice to this community, it begins with the debt I owe her, a debt I do not intend to leave unpaid. The crowd's murmur shifted again, this time edged with something new, a mixture of awe and calculation, as people began reassessing the quiet seamstress's daughter they had known their entire lives, wondering what her sudden connection to a duke might mean, for her, and perhaps for themselves. That evening, back at the cottage, Ellen sat across from Aldrich at the small kitchen table, her expression a careful mixture of relief and lingering caution. "Now that the truth is known," she said, "what happens to my daughter? Men of your position do not typically concern themselves further with families like ours, once the immediate matter is resolved." "I did not offer my gratitude as an empty gesture," Aldrich said. "Clara's help was invaluable, and I intend to see that both her sacrifice and the suffering of every family in this town under Colton's corruption are properly addressed, publicly and completely." Ellen studied him for a long moment, her mother's instincts clearly weighing more than simple gratitude in the careful way Aldrich spoke of Clara, the warmth that crept into his voice despite his obvious effort to keep the conversation businesslike. She said nothing further on the matter, though Clara caught the knowing look her mother gave her once Aldrich had excused himself to confer with the men who had arrived to serve him. Over the following days, Aldrich's presence transformed the household in ways both welcome and complicated. The men who had arrived with him, a steward named Godfrey and a younger clerk called Edwin Marsh, set up a temporary base of operations in the cottage's small parlor, reviewing the testimony Clara had gathered, alongside additional records Godfrey had managed to retrieve quietly from the estate's own offices, before Colton grew suspicious of his loyalty. The picture that emerged was damning. Rents collected from dozens of tenant families far exceeded what appeared in the official estate ledgers. The difference quietly funneled through a network of false repair invoices and phantom improvements that had never actually been made. Vane, it became clear, was only the smallest piece of a larger arrangement. A local enforcer paid to maintain the fiction, while Colton and at least 2 other estate officials split the stolen income between them. One afternoon, while Godfrey and the young clerk pored over ledgers in the parlor, Aldrich asked Clara to walk with him along the edge of the property, past the garden where her mother had once grown enough vegetables to sell a small surplus at market, before the years of raised rent made such generosity impossible. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the smell of wood smoke from a dozen chimneys across town, and for a while neither of them spoke, content simply to walk together in a silence that had grown comfortable between them over the past weeks. "I never properly thanked you," Aldrich said finally, "for what you did that first day in the square. I have replayed it 100 times since. If you had not stepped forward, I do not believe I would have survived that crowd." "You do not need to thank me again," Clara said. "You have already said as much in front of the whole town. That was gratitude owed to you publicly. As the Duke, Aldrich said. This is something different. This is simply Aldrich, thanking Clara for choosing kindness when it cost her something real to offer it. Clara felt her cheeks warm despite the cold air, and she found herself unable to hold his gaze for more than a moment, before looking away toward the bare autumn fields stretching beyond the garden wall. I did not do it thinking of any reward, she said quietly. I know, Aldrich said. That is precisely why it mattered so much. They walked a while longer without speaking, and Clara allowed herself, just for those few minutes, to imagine a version of her life where the distance between a duke and a seamstress's daughter did not exist at all, where kindness alone might be enough to bridge whatever divided them. She knew it was foolish even as she thought it, knew that whatever warmth had grown between them during these strange, dangerous weeks would likely fade once his true life reclaimed him fully, once titles and estates and the expectations of his position settled back over him like a coat he could not simply choose to remove. But for those few minutes beside the garden wall, she allowed herself the foolishness anyway, unwilling to surrender every quiet joy to the fear of what might come later. You have built a case even I did not believe possible in so short a time, Godfrey told Clara one evening, reviewing her carefully documented testimonies with evident respect. 20 years I have served this estate, and I never once suspected the scale of what Colton had arranged beneath our notice. He is clever, Clara said. He built it slowly enough that no single change looked suspicious on its own. Clever, Aldrich agreed grimly, but not invisible, not any longer. Yet even as the case against Colton solidified, whispers began circulating through town of a different nature entirely. Whispers that had nothing to do with rents or corruption, and everything to do with Clara herself. She noticed the change first in the way certain women in the market began watching her with narrowed, calculating eyes, in the way conversations quieted slightly when she passed, resuming again once she had moved out of earshot, carrying a different tone than before. Word had reached town, it seemed, not only of Clara's role in exposing Colton's corruption, but of the growing closeness between her and the Duke himself, a closeness that had not gone unnoticed during the long evenings Aldrich spent at the cottage reviewing evidence, evenings that often extended well past the point strictly necessary for their work together. You should be careful, Ellen warned her one night, how visible your friendship with him has become. Envy makes people cruel, Clara, and there will be those in this town who resent seeing the Duke's attention fall on someone they consider beneath such notice, however unjust that resentment may be. I have done nothing wrong, Clara said. Doing nothing wrong has rarely stopped people from finding a way to punish someone for rising above where they believe that person belongs, Ellen said, and there was a weariness in her voice that came from long experience with the particular cruelty small towns reserved for anyone who dared to become something more than expected. Clara tried to dismiss her mother's warning, focused instead on the satisfaction of watching Colton's carefully constructed deception unravel thread by thread. But a small, uneasy feeling settled beneath her chest regardless, a sense that the very success she and Aldrich had built together might soon draw a different kind of danger, one aimed not at exposing corruption, but at destroying her simply for daring to stand close enough to a duke that people had begun to wonder if she thought herself equal to him. That uneasy feeling proved well-founded only days later, when Godfrey arrived at the cottage with news that darkened Aldrich's expression considerably. Colton has learned of the investigation, Godfrey said. He has already begun moving funds and destroying records at the estate. Worse, Your Grace, word has reached us that he intends to strike back, not against you directly, where such an attack would immediately implicate him, but against someone closer to you, someone with far less protection. Aldrich's eyes moved immediately to Clara, and the fear that flickered across his usually composed features told her, more clearly than any words could, exactly who Colton intended to target in his desperate attempt to silence the truth before it could fully reach the light. What do you mean exactly? Ellen asked, rising from her chair with an urgency that mirrored the sudden tightness in Clara's own chest. Godfrey hesitated, glancing at Aldrich as though seeking permission to continue. He means to discredit her, Your Grace, before he moves against the evidence itself. If he can convince the town that Clara's testimony gathering was driven by dishonest motives, or worse, that her character cannot be trusted, any case built upon what she has collected becomes vulnerable to doubt. It is a common tactic among men like Colton. When the facts cannot be denied, attack the messenger instead. Clara felt the floor seem to tilt slightly beneath her feet. They would spread lies about me, she said, understanding settling over her slowly, cold and unwelcome. I will not allow it, Aldrich said, his voice hard with a fury Clara had not heard from him before, not even in the moments describing Colton's betrayal of his father's trust. Whatever Colton attempts, I will stand publicly beside the truth of what you have done for this town, regardless of what lies he tries to spread. You may not have full control over how quickly rumor moves once it begins, Godfrey said gently, not unkindly, but Colton is desperate now, and desperate men do not calculate consequences the way careful men do. He will strike quickly and without mercy, hoping the damage is done before either of you can respond. Ellen crossed the room and took Clara's hand, her grip firm despite the worry etched clearly across her face. Whatever comes, she said, we will face it together, as we always have. Clara nodded, though the uneasy feeling that had followed her through the market days earlier had returned now in full force, no longer a vague premonition but a concrete threat with a name and a motive, closing in around her from a direction she had never fully anticipated when she first knelt beside a bleeding stranger in a crowded square, asking for nothing more than the chance to see justice done. Later that night, once the house had quieted, and Godfrey and his clerk had retired to the small room Aldrich had arranged for them at the inn, Aldrich lingered a while longer at the cottage, unwilling to leave before speaking with Clara alone. I need you to understand something, he said, standing near the door with a seriousness that stripped away every trace of the polished authority he had worn in the square. Whatever Colton throws at you, whatever lies he manufactures, I will not allow it to define how this town, or I, see you. You have shown more integrity in these past weeks than half the men in my own council, and I intend to make certain that truth outlasts whatever slander he attempts. I am not afraid of him, Clara said, though her voice wavered slightly on the words, betraying the fear she had been trying to master since Godfrey's warning. It is not foolish to be afraid, Aldrich said gently. It would only be foolish to let that fear convince you to stop standing for what is right. I do not believe you are capable of that, whatever comes. Clara held his gaze for a long moment, drawing a quiet strength from the certainty in his voice, and when he finally left for the night, she stood at the window watching his silhouette disappear down the darkened lane, aware that whatever storm Colton intended to unleash against her reputation, she would not face it as the same frightened girl who had once hidden behind a bread stall, wondering whether to step forward at all. The rumor spread through town like fire through dry grass, faster and more destructive than Clara could have imagined even after Godfrey's warning. By the second morning, she could feel it in the way women at the market pulled their children closer as she passed, in the way conversations stopped entirely rather than merely quieting, in the cold, appraising stares that followed her from stall to stall as she attempted, foolishly, to continue her ordinary errands as though nothing had changed. The story, when she finally heard the full version from a sympathetic baker's wife who pulled her aside near the edge of the square, was uglier than anything she had anticipated. Someone, an anonymous letter delivered to several prominent households across town, claimed that Clara had deliberately orchestrated the entire affair, that she had recognized Aldrich's true identity from the very beginning, and had schemed to trap a duke into gratitude and affection for the sole purpose of elevating her family's fortunes. Worse, the letter suggested that her nightly visits to the shed during his recovery had been far from innocent, painting a picture of scandalous behavior designed to destroy whatever respectability remained to her name. It is a lie, every word of it, Clara said, her hands trembling as the baker's wife recounted the details as gently as she could manage. I know that, dear, the woman said, though there was an uncertainty in her eyes that told Clara the reassurance was not shared by everyone in town. But you know how quickly people believe the worst, especially about a girl who has suddenly found herself standing closer to a duke than anyone expected. Clara returned home that afternoon to find her mother already aware of the rumors, having heard a cruder version from a neighbor who had stopped by under the thin pretense of borrowing flour. Ellen's face was pale with barely controlled fury, though she kept her voice steady as she relayed what she had learned. They are saying you trapped him, Ellen said, that you are no better than a common opportunist, willing to ruin your own reputation for the chance at rising above your station. Clara sank into a chair at the kitchen table, the accumulated weight of the past hours finally settling over her. And what do you believe? She asked quietly. I believe my daughter has more honor in her smallest finger than half the gossiping tongues spreading this filth combined, Ellen said fiercely, and I intend to say so to anyone who repeats it within my hearing. But belief alone will not undo the damage already spreading through this town, Clara. We must think carefully about what comes next. When Aldrich arrived that evening, his expression carried a controlled fury that reminded Clara sharply of the authority he had displayed the day his true identity was revealed in the square. Godfrey has traced the letter, he said without preamble. It originated from Colton's own hand, though he was clever enough to have it copied and distributed by a third party who cannot be directly connected back to him. Vane, we believe, played some role in ensuring the letters reached the households most likely to spread the story quickly. Can it be proven? Ellen asked. Not yet, decisively, Aldrich admitted. But it does not need to be proven to be understood as exactly what it is. A deliberate attempt to destroy Clara's credibility before we can bring the full case against Colton before my counsel and the magistrate. If people believe Clara is dishonest, capable of scheming and manipulation, then every testimony she gathered becomes suspect in the eyes of anyone inclined to doubt it. Then what do we do? Clara asked, though the fear beneath the question had begun hardening into something closer to determination. We move faster than Colton anticipated, Aldrich said. Godfrey has finished cross-referencing the ledgers against the tenant testimonies you gathered. The proof is undeniable, complete enough to withstand scrutiny from even his most sympathetic allies. I intend to call a public gathering at the estate hall within the week, where the full truth will be presented before the town, the magistrate, and my own counsel together. Colton will have no opportunity to twist the narrative once every piece of evidence stands exposed at once. And the letter, Ellen asked. The lies about Clara will be addressed directly, publicly and completely, Aldrich said, his eyes finding Clara's with a steadiness that offered more comfort than she expected. I do not intend to let a single word of it stand unanswered. The days leading up to the gathering passed in a strange, tense blur. Clara continued her work alongside Godfrey and the clerk, reviewing final details of the case even as the whispers around town grew louder, occasionally spilling into open cruelty. A woman she had known since childhood crossed the street rather than walk near her. Someone scrawled an ugly word across the front gate of the cottage one night, forcing Tom to scrub it away before their mother could see it. Though Ellen noticed anyway and said nothing, her silence somehow more painful than any argument could have been. Worse than the whispers, though, was the growing doubt Clara sometimes caught in her own thoughts late at night. A quiet, insidious voice asking whether any of this had truly been worth the cost. Whether the girl she had been before that afternoon in the market square, ordinary and unremarkable and safe, might have led a simpler, kinder life than the one now unfolding around her in public spectacle and scandal. She confessed this doubt to Aldrich one evening, unable to keep it entirely hidden any longer, as they sat together in the parlor after Godfrey and the clerk had retired for the night. Do you regret it? Aldrich asked quietly. Stepping forward that day. Clara considered the question seriously before answering. No, she said finally. I do not regret helping you. I do not even regret gathering the truth about Colton, however dangerous it has become. What I regret is discovering how quickly people I have known my whole life were willing to believe the worst of me, based on nothing more than a letter written by a man desperate to protect his own crimes. That says far more about them than it does about you, Aldrich said. Cruelty spreads easily because believing the worst requires no courage at all. What you did, standing forward in that square, gathering testimony at real risk to yourself, required more courage than anyone spreading these lies could ever hope to summon in their own lives. Clara felt tears gathering unexpectedly at his words, and she blinked them back quickly, unwilling to let the accumulated strain of the past days finally break through in front of him. Aldrich noticed anyway, and without quite deciding to do so, reached across the small space between them and took her hand, his grip warm and steady despite everything. Whatever happens at the gathering, he said, whatever the outcome for Colton or for the town's opinion of either of us, I want you to know that my regard for you has never been about gratitude alone. It grew from watching you choose courage again and again, even when every choice cost you something real. That is not something I take lightly, Clara, and it is not something a few cruel letters will ever change in my eyes. Clara did not trust herself to speak, and for a long moment they simply sat together in the quiet parlor, the weight of everything unspoken between them settling into something that felt, for the first time in days, less like fear and more like quiet, fragile hope. But the fragile peace of that evening did not last. 2 days before the scheduled gathering, Tom came running into the cottage in a panic, his face white with fear, reporting that he had overheard 2 of Vane's men talking near the tavern about a plan to intercept Godfrey's carriage on the road back from the magistrate's office, where he had traveled that morning to formally register the evidence ahead of the public hearing. They mean to destroy the ledgers, Aldrich said grimly, once Tom had finished his breathless account. Without that physical proof, Colton could still claim the testimonies alone are insufficient, or worse, fabricated entirely by a scorned girl seeking revenge for imagined slights. We have to warn Godfrey, Clara said, already reaching for her shawl. Aldrich caught her arm gently but firmly. It is too dangerous. If Colton's men are indeed watching the road, riding out to warn him yourself could put you directly in harm's way. Exactly what Colton would want. an opportunity to remove you from this entirely before the truth can be presented. Then what do we do? Clara demanded. We cannot simply wait here and hope nothing happens. Aldrich was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing options with the same careful calculation Clara had come to recognize as central to his character, the instinct of a man accustomed to protecting others even at cost to himself. I will ride out myself, with 2 of the men Godfrey brought from the estate, he said finally. If Colton's men see the Duke of Ashcombe riding to intercept them, they will think twice before acting rashly, whatever their orders. You will stay here, with your mother and Tom, where I know you are safe. I am not afraid, Clara said again, though this time Aldrich shook his head firmly. This is not about fear, Clara. It is about odds, and I will not risk you unnecessarily when there is another way to protect what we have built together. Please, let me do this. Reluctantly, Clara agreed, though the hours that followed, waiting alone with her mother and brother in the quiet cottage while Aldrich rode out into uncertain danger, proved among the longest and most agonizing of her life. Every creak of the house, every distant sound on the road, sending her heart racing with fear that the man who had first taught her the true cost and the true worth of standing forward when others walked away might not return to see the truth finally brought into the light. On the road north of town, Aldrich and the 2 estate men caught up with Godfrey's carriage just as it rounded a bend, flanked by dense hedgerows, the kind of narrow stretch a man might choose deliberately if he intended an ambush unseen from either direction. Aldrich felt the tension in his own chest sharpen the moment he spotted 3 riders positioned along the tree line ahead, their horses still, waiting with a patience that confirmed every fear Tom's overheard conversation had raised. Godfrey's driver slowed the carriage uncertainly, and one of Vane's men, a heavy-set figure Aldrich recognized from the day Vane had first come inspecting the cottage with his companion, urged his horse forward to block the road entirely. There is no need for this to become difficult, the man called out, his tone carrying false civility. We only wish to inspect the carriage for certain documents that were removed from the estate offices without proper authorization. Aldrich rode forward deliberately, letting his own bearing and the fine quality of his mount speak before he said a word. The man's eyes widened with unmistakable recognition, and behind him, the other 2 riders exchanged an uneasy glance, clearly unprepared to find the Duke himself present rather than merely Godfrey traveling alone. Those documents belong to my estate, and to the tenants who gave sworn testimony trusting they would reach the magistrate safely, Aldrich said, his voice cold and carrying easily across the narrow road. I would think carefully, sir, before you continue whatever instruction brought you to this particular stretch of road today. Whoever sent you has already exposed himself through this very attempt, and I intend to remember every face present when this matter is laid before the magistrate. The heavy-set man hesitated, clearly weighing the difference between whatever payment or threat had compelled him to this task, and the far greater danger of being identified attacking a duke's carriage in broad daylight. After a long, tense moment, he muttered something to his companions, and the 3 riders wheeled their horses and retreated back into the trees without another word, choosing the safer path of quiet withdrawal over open confrontation, with consequences none of them were prepared to bear. Godfrey exhaled audibly once the riders had disappeared. That was closer than I would have liked, Your Grace, he said, wiping a hand across his brow despite the cool afternoon air. Colton grows more desperate by the day, Aldrich said, watching the tree line carefully even as they resumed their journey toward town. Which means we are closer to the truth than he can afford to allow. We ride together the rest of the way, and the Ledgers do not leave your sight again before the gathering. They completed the journey without further incident, though Aldrich remained alert the entire distance, his thoughts circling back repeatedly to Clara waiting anxiously at the cottage, and the growing understanding that whatever affection had taken root between them over these strange weeks had become something he was no longer willing to imagine his life without, whatever complications his title might eventually place between them. Dusk had fully settled by the time Aldrich's horse finally appeared on the lane leading to the cottage, and Clara, who had spent the last hour standing at the window rather than pretending to occupy herself with any pretense of calm, was out the door and across the yard before her mother could call her back to caution. Aldrich dismounted quickly, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the relief of his safe return settling over the small distance between them like something almost tangible. You are unharmed, Clara said, though it came out more as confirmation than question, her eyes moving over him as though needing to verify the truth of it herself. Colton's men thought better of their plan once they realized who rode with Godfrey's carriage, Aldrich said. The Ledgers are safe. Godfrey has already begun preparing them for the gathering. Clara felt the tension of the past hours finally begin to loosen in her chest, though a residual tremor remained in her hands, the accumulated fear of nearly losing him settling slowly into something gentler now that the danger had passed. "I was afraid," she admitted quietly. "Something I told myself I would not be afraid of, and yet I was." "That is not a weakness," Aldrich said gently. "It only means the past weeks have connected us in ways that neither odds nor ledgers can fully explain." Inside, Ellen had prepared a simple meal despite the late hour, and the household settled into an evening quieter than any they had known since Aldrich's true identity had first been revealed in the square. The shared relief of a crisis narrowly avoided drawing them together around the small table, with a warmth that felt, for the first time in days, unburdened by fear of what still lay ahead. 2 days remained before the gathering, Aldrich said finally, as the meal wound down and Tom's eyelids grew heavy with the lateness of the hour. "Whatever Colton attempts between now and then, we face it together, and once the truth stands before the whole town, there will be no more shadows left for him, or his lies about you, Clara, to hide within." Clara met his eyes across the table, drawing strength from the steadiness she found there, and though the coming days would test every ounce of courage she had discovered in herself since that first afternoon in the crowded market square, she found she was ready, at last, to stand fully in whatever light the truth would finally bring, whatever it revealed, and whatever it cost. On the morning of the gathering, Clara woke before dawn, unable to sleep any longer despite the exhaustion of the previous days. She dressed carefully in her best gown, a simple blue dress her mother had mended and pressed the night before, and stood for a long moment in front of the small mirror in her room, studying her own reflection as though trying to recognize the person she had become since that afternoon in the market square. "You look every bit as steady as you feel inside," Ellen said from the doorway, watching her daughter with quiet pride. "Whatever happens today, remember that the truth has never needed permission to be believed. It only needed someone brave enough to speak it clearly." Clara embraced her mother tightly, grateful beyond words for the steadiness Ellen had provided through every uncertain turn of the past weeks. Downstairs, Tom waited by the door, dressed in his own best clothes, insisting he would not miss the day his sister helped bring a corrupt man to justice, whatever Ellen might say about keeping him home from such serious proceedings. The ride to the estate hall passed in tense silence, broken only by Godfrey's occasional review of the order in which evidence would be presented, ensuring nothing was left to chance. Aldrich rode alongside the carriage rather than within it, his attention fixed on the road ahead, watchful for any final desperate move Colton's allies might attempt before the truth could be formally presented. None came, though the tension of the journey did little to settle the nervous energy building in Clara's chest with every mile that brought them closer to the hall. The estate hall had never held so many people at once, not even during the harvest celebrations Clara remembered from childhood, when tenants and townsfolk alike had gathered to share in whatever abundance the season provided. Today the mood carried none of that lightness. Rows of chairs stretched across the great room, filled with tenant families, town merchants, members of Aldrich's council summoned urgently from neighboring estates, and the magistrate himself, seated near the front with a stack of documents already prepared before him. Clara stood near the side of the hall with her mother and Tom, her heart hammering despite Aldrich's earlier assurance that her presence here today was as essential as any piece of evidence Godfrey had gathered. Across the room, she caught sight of Edgar Colton for the first time, a tall, silver-haired man with cold, calculating eyes that swept the gathered crowd with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to controlling every room he entered. Beside him stood Vane, considerably less composed, his gaze darting nervously toward the door as though still weighing whether escape remained possible. Aldrich entered last, dressed now in the formal attire befitting his true position, and the transformation struck Clara powerfully. The same steady eyes she had come to know so well now framed by a bearing that commanded instant silence across the entire hall. He took his place at the front of the room, Godfrey at his side with a thick folder of evidence, and began without preamble. 3 weeks ago, I left this estate disguised, to investigate concerns raised about the management of tenant rents and estate repairs, Aldrich said, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the crowded hall. What I discovered exceeded even my worst suspicions. He nodded to Godfrey, who began methodically presenting the evidence, ledger after ledger laid open beside the falsified records Colton had submitted to the estate's official accounts, the discrepancies stark and undeniable once placed side by side. Testimony followed, read aloud from the pages Clara had gathered, family after family describing rents raised without cause, repairs promised and never completed, threats of eviction used to silence complaints, while coin that should have maintained their homes vanished into accounts controlled by men who had never set foot on the properties they claimed to manage. Colton's composure cracked slightly with each revelation, though he maintained a thin veneer of outraged denial, insisting the discrepancies were simple bookkeeping errors, the testimonies exaggerated by tenants eager to avoid legitimate debts. But as Godfrey continued, presenting bank records that traced stolen rents directly to accounts held under Colton's own relatives, the fiction became impossible to sustain even for the most sympathetic members of the council. "And what of the accusations against this young woman?" Colton finally said, his desperation showing through as he gestured sharply toward Clara, drawing every eye in the hall toward her. Surely the council should consider the reliability of testimony gathered by someone with an obvious personal interest in seeing me discredited, given her evident designs on securing the Duke's favor. A ripple of tension moved through the crowd, and Clara felt her pulse quicken, though she forced herself to stand tall rather than shrink beneath the weight of every gaze now assessing her. Aldrich stepped forward before anyone else could respond, his expression hardening into something Clara had not seen from him before, quiet fury restrained beneath perfect control. "I anticipated this deflection," he said, "and I have proof of its origin as well." He nodded to Godfrey, who produced a final document, the anonymous letter that had spread through town days earlier, alongside a signed statement from the printer who had confirmed the handwriting matched correspondence previously sent from Colton's own office regarding estate business. "You accuse Clara Whitmore of scheming for personal gain," Aldrich continued, addressing the letter's contents directly, when in truth it was you who manufactured lies to protect yourself, spreading them through this town with the same calculated cruelty you used to steal from families who trusted you to safeguard their homes. Miss Whitmore gathered this evidence at genuine risk to her own safety and reputation, expecting nothing in return beyond the simple hope that justice might finally reach the people you have spent years exploiting. Murmurs swept through the hall, and Clara watched as the expressions of those who had whispered cruel judgments about her over the past days shifted visibly, embarrassment and shame replacing suspicion, as the full truth of Colton's manipulation became undeniable before them all. The magistrate rose from his seat, addressing the hall with the formal weight of his office. "Given the evidence presented today," he said, "I find sufficient grounds to remove Edgar Colton from all positions of authority within this estate immediately, pending full criminal proceedings for theft and fraud on a considerable scale. Mr. Vane's role in enforcing these fraudulent practices will likewise be examined thoroughly, and restitution will be pursued on behalf of every family harmed by this arrangement." Colton's composure finally broke entirely, and he was led from the hall under guard, his protests growing increasingly hollow as the doors closed behind him, silencing whatever final justifications he had hoped to offer. Vane, pale and shaking, was escorted out separately, his earlier bravado utterly extinguished. A weight seemed to lift from the entire hall once both men had gone, and the assembled tenants began speaking among themselves, disbelief giving way slowly to something like cautious hope as the magistrate outlined the process for reviewing and correcting years of fraudulent rent charges. Margaret Poole wept openly, and Edwin Hale gripped his wife's hand tightly, the relief of finally being believed evident on both their faces. One by one, several of the townspeople who had whispered cruel rumors about Clara in the preceding days approached her quietly, offering awkward but sincere apologies now that the truth of Colton's manipulation stood so plainly exposed before them. A woman who had crossed the street rather than walked near her only a week earlier now clasped Clara's hands warmly, admitting she had let fear and gossip cloud her better judgment. Clara accepted each apology graciously, understanding that fear had driven much of the town's earlier suspicion, the same fear that had once kept every bystander frozen at the edge of the market square, while a stranger stood alone against an angry crowd. Aldrich turned then, and rather than continuing with the formal proceedings, he crossed the hall directly toward Clara, ignoring the surprised murmurs that followed his path. He stopped before her, and for a moment, the noise of the crowded room seemed to fade entirely, leaving only the two of them standing amid the aftermath of everything they had built together. "I owe you a debt I can never fully repay," Aldrich said, loud enough now for those nearby to hear clearly. "You saved my life in that market square when every other person chose to look away. You risked your safety and your reputation to help me expose a betrayal I never wanted to believe possible. And you did it all without ever asking for anything in return." Clara felt her throat tighten, unable to find words adequate to the moment, and Aldrich continued, his voice carrying a vulnerability she had rarely heard from him even in their most private conversations. "I do not wish to simply repay a debt," he said. "I wish to build something further, something neither of us anticipated when you stepped between me and that crowd, Clara Whitmore. Whatever distance exists between our stations, I have come to believe it matters far less than the courage and integrity you have shown me every single day since. Will you allow me to court you properly, openly, before this entire town, with every intention of making my regard for you permanent, should you find yourself willing to accept it?" The hall had gone almost entirely silent, every eye fixed on the two of them, and Clara felt the weight of the moment settle over her, not as fear this time, but as something closer to the same quiet courage that had first carried her across the market square weeks earlier. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "I will." The hall erupted into applause, tentative at first from those still adjusting to the astonishing turn events had taken, then genuine and warm as the reality settled fully among the gathered crowd. A town that had watched a stranger's defense turn into something extraordinary. A seamstress's daughter who had chosen courage when everyone else chose to walk away, now standing before them as the future Duchess of Ashcombe. In the weeks following the hearing, the full scale of the restitution owed to Colton's victims became clear, and Aldrich personally oversaw the process of returning what had been stolen, ensuring that families like the Pools finally received the roof repairs they had been promised years earlier, and that Edwin Hale's plow horse, which had very nearly been seized over a manufactured debt, remained safely in his own barn where it belonged. Vane, stripped of his position and facing his own share of consequences before the magistrate, left the town entirely within the month, unable to face the neighbors whose trust he had so thoroughly betrayed. Pratt, the merchant whose accusation had started the entire chain of events in the market square, approached Clara privately one afternoon, his usual bluster entirely absent. "I judged too quickly that day," he admitted, "and I have thought of it often since, wondering what might have happened had you not stepped forward the way you did." Clara accepted his apology graciously, understanding that the fear which had driven the crowd that day lived in nearly everyone, herself included, and that the true measure of character lay not in never feeling that fear, but in choosing, despite it, to act with courage when it mattered most. Word of the scandal and its resolution spread well beyond the town itself, carried by travelers and merchants to neighboring estates, and Aldrich standing among his fellow nobility, rather than suffering from the exposure of corruption within his own household, grew considerably, admired for the thoroughness and fairness with which he had rooted out wrongdoing, rather than quietly concealing it to protect his own reputation. Several other estate owners, hearing the full account, quietly began reviewing their own stewards' records, uneasy at the thought of similar schemes operating undetected beneath their own notice. Clara's own family moved from the small cottage into rooms befitting her new position, though she insisted on maintaining her friendships throughout town, refusing to let her changed circumstances distance her from the community that had shaped her. She continued visiting Margaret Poole for tea each week, and made certain that Tom received not only his return to proper schooling but tutoring from one of the estate's finest instructors, determined that her brother's future would never again be threatened by the kind of desperate poverty that had once forced him to consider abandoning his education for firewood money. On a bright spring morning, beneath the same elm tree that had once stood witness to her sleepless nights of worry and doubt, Clara stood beside Aldrich as vows were exchanged before the entire town. The very people who had once watched a mob nearly destroy a stranger now gathered instead to celebrate the quiet, unexpected love that had grown from one moment of courage nobody else had been willing to offer. Margaret Poole wept happily among the guests, and even Silas Pratt stood near the back of the crowd, applauding as warmly as anyone present. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to celebrate with food and music laid out across the estate grounds, Ellen found a quiet moment to stand beside her daughter, watching the joy unfolding around them. "I never imagined, on the morning that stranger stumbled into our lives, that it would lead us here," she said softly. "Nor did I," Clara admitted, watching Aldrich across the lawn as he laughed with Tom over some small joke. "But I have learned that the smallest choices, the ones that seem to cost us the most in the moment, are sometimes the very choices that open the door to everything good that follows." Clara Whitmore, who had once stepped forward when everyone else walked away, became Clara Ashcombe, Duchess in truth as much as in title, having proven, through every difficult choice along the way, that kindness offered freely, without expectation of reward, could change not only one stranger's fate, but an entire town's future as well, and her own, in ways she could never have imagined on that ordinary afternoon, when a basket of turnips had been forgotten in her hand. A year after the wedding, a carriage bearing the Ashcombe crest rolled into town on a cool autumn morning, drawing curious glances from merchants setting up their stalls for the day. Clara stepped down before the driver could fully bring the horses to a stop, eager as always to walk the familiar market square on foot rather than remain confined behind glass and polished wood. The square looked different now, though the old fountain still stood at its center, water trickling steadily as it always had. New shop fronts had replaced several that had stood empty during the years of Colton's quiet extortion, and the general mood of the town carried a lightness Clara remembered only faintly from her childhood, before rising rents and constant fear had settled over every transaction like a permanent shadow. "Duchess," a voice called warmly, and Clara turned to see Margaret Poole approaching with a basket of late-season apples balanced on her hip. Her roof, Clara knew, long since properly repaired, her cottage finally warm and dry through the harsh winter months. The two women embraced without hesitation, a friendship that had endured, despite the widening distance their circumstances now placed between them. "You still insist on walking the market yourself," Margaret said, shaking her head with fond exasperation. "Half the noble wives in the county send servants for such errands." "I have never much cared what half the noble wives in the county consider proper," Clara said, smiling. "Besides, I would miss this square terribly if I let a servant claim every visit for themselves." They walked together toward the bread stall, catching up on the small, ordinary news of the town, whose children had grown, whose harvest had proven particularly generous, whose romance had blossomed unexpectedly over the summer months. It was this ordinary rhythm of life that Clara treasured most about her visits home, a reminder of the world she had come from, grounding her firmly against any temptation to forget the struggles that had shaped her long before a title had been added to her name. Near the fountain, Clara paused, studying the exact spot where she had once stood frozen with a basket of turnips, watching a stranger face down an angry crowd alone. So much had changed since that afternoon, and yet the fountain itself remained precisely as she remembered it, water catching the morning light in the same familiar pattern it always had, indifferent to the enormous shifts that had unfolded around it. Aldrich found her there a short while later, having finished his own business at the town hall, reviewing the latest reports on tenant welfare across the estate. He was still Duke of Ashcombe, still burdened by the weight of responsibility that came with the title, but the guarded wariness that had once defined him during those first weeks of their acquaintance had softened considerably, replaced by an ease Clara had watched grow steadily over their year of marriage. "You are thinking of that first day again," he said, coming to stand beside her at the fountain's edge, reading her expression with the familiarity of a man who had learned to understand her thoughtful silences. "I often do, when I stand here," Clara admitted. "It astonishes me still, how a single choice, made in the space of a few frightened heartbeats, could lead to everything that followed." Aldrich took her hand, threading his fingers through hers without concern for who might observe them, a habit that had scandalized precisely no one in this particular town, where the story of the seamstress's daughter who had married the Duke had long since become a source of local pride rather than gossip. "It was not luck that led us here," he said. "It was your choice to act when everyone else chose fear. I have never stopped being grateful for it, nor stopped marveling at the courage it required." Their reflection continued through the morning as they walked the familiar streets together, stopping to speak with tenants and shopkeepers alike, Clara asking after specific hardships she remembered from her own years of struggle, ensuring that the estate's promises of fair treatment had not quietly faded once the initial excitement of Colton's exposure had settled into routine. She found to her relief that conditions across the town had genuinely improved, rents reasonable and consistently applied, repairs completed within a fair span of time, the quiet fear that had once colored every interaction between tenant and landlord replaced by something closer to mutual respect. Later that afternoon, as they prepared to return to the estate, a young girl approached Clara shyly near the edge of the square, no older than 8 or 9, clutching a small bundle of wildflowers she had clearly gathered along the roadside. "My mother said you helped a stranger once, when no one else would," the girl said, offering the flowers with the earnest solemnity children reserve for matters they consider deeply important. "She said it was the bravest thing anyone in this town ever did." Clara knelt to accept the flowers, meeting the girl's wide, curious eyes with a warmth that came easily now, though it had once felt like the most frightening choice of her entire life. "It was not so very brave," she said gently. "I only did what I hoped someone would do for me, if our positions had been reversed." "That still sounds brave to me," the girl said, with the simple, unshakable certainty of childhood, before darting back toward her mother, waiting near the bakery, leaving Clara smiling after her, with the flowers held carefully in her hands. That evening, back within the quiet comfort of the estate's private rooms, Clara stood at the window overlooking the gardens, watching the last light of the day fade slowly across the grounds where her own wedding had taken place beneath the elm tree the town had transplanted from beside her family's old cottage. A gift from Aldrich that had moved her to tears when she first discovered it standing newly rooted in the estate garden, a small piece of her old life carried forward into her new one. Aldrich joined her at the window, wrapping an arm gently around her shoulders as they watched the sunset together in comfortable silence. "Do you ever wish you could return to that ordinary life?" he asked eventually, the quiet uncertainty of the question betraying a concern he rarely voiced aloud. That perhaps all of this, the title, the responsibility, the constant scrutiny of a public life, had cost her more than she ever admitted. Clara considered the question honestly before answering, as she always did with matters that mattered deeply to her. "I do not wish to return to it," she said finally, "though I never wish to forget it either. That life taught me things this one could never teach on its own. Patience, humility, the true weight of struggle carried by people this estate is meant to serve. I would rather carry both lives within me than surrender either one entirely." Aldrich pressed a gentle kiss to her temple, and they remained at the window together, as darkness settled fully over the grounds, the estate's lamps flickering to life one by one across the property, illuminating a home that had, over the past year, become something far warmer and more genuine than the cold, formal house Clara remembered visiting nervously during those early days of their courtship. Word of Clara's advocacy for fair treatment of tenants eventually spread beyond the boundaries of the Ashcombe estate, and she found herself receiving letters from wives and daughters of other noble families, curious about the practices she and Aldrich had implemented, some genuinely interested in reform, others simply eager to be associated with a story that had captured the imagination of the wider county. Clara answered every genuine inquiry patiently, sharing what she had learned about listening closely to tenants rather than relying solely on the reports of stewards who might, however innocently, miss the small signs of hardship that mattered most. One particular letter arrived from a young woman named Eleanor Voss, whose own family estate several counties away had recently uncovered irregularities, disturbingly similar to Colton's scheme, though caught far earlier thanks to a steward who had grown suspicious after hearing the story of Ashcombe's public reckoning. Clara corresponded with her for months, offering guidance drawn from her own hard-won experience, and the two women eventually became close friends, meeting whenever their travels allowed, bonded by the unusual paths that had led them both into positions neither had been raised to expect. In the years that followed, Clara continued her quiet work advocating for the tenants across the estate, establishing a fund specifically intended to help families facing sudden hardship, drawing on her own memory of what it felt like to watch a landlord's shadow fall across a family struggling simply to survive an unforgiving season. Tom grew into a capable young man, eventually taking a position managing several of the estate's properties himself, determined to ensure that no steward under his watch would ever again exploit the trust placed in them the way Colton once had. Ellen remained close by, her quiet wisdom sought often by both her daughter and son-in-law, a steady presence through every new challenge their unusual, extraordinary life continued to bring. Each year, on the anniversary of that first encounter in the market square, Clara returned to stand quietly beside the fountain for a few private minutes before the day's usual duties began, a small ritual she never explained fully to anyone, not even Aldrich, though he always seemed to understand without needing to ask. It was not sorrow that drew her back to that spot each year, nor even simple nostalgia, but something closer to gratitude, a private acknowledgement of the ordinary morning that had, through one difficult choice, opened into an entirely unexpected life. Tom often teased her gently about the tradition, calling it her yearly pilgrimage, though even he understood, in his own quiet way, how much that single square had shaped the course of their entire family's fortune. Ellen, growing older but no less sharp in her observations, liked to remind Clara during these visits that courage rarely announced itself as courage in the moment it was needed. It simply felt, she said, like doing the only thing that seemed possible to live with afterward. And though the town eventually grew accustomed to the sight of the Duchess walking freely through its market square, greeting old friends and asking after their troubles with the same genuine warmth she had always carried, the story of that first afternoon, when a stranger had stood alone against an angry crowd, and one young woman had stepped forward when everyone else walked away, remained a story told and retold for years afterward, a quiet reminder to every child who grew up hearing it that courage, however small it might feel in the moment it is offered, has the power to change not only a single life, but the whole shape of everything that follows.